Alright, hello everybody. I'm back here again with another book that I'd like to take a look at, Love in the Time of Cholera. It's a classic novel, Latino historical story that reached international respect and is renowned as a great story of love. And as is the case with a lot of texts of the past, there's things in it that might make someone take issue with, but I think that if you choose to take it at face value, to a large extent, it's something that you can really enjoy and can use as escapism. It's not one of those ones that you really want to interrogate a lot. So it's kind of just something that if you have the stomach for things like that, if you can sort of look past certain issues, you can enjoy the text. I definitely had trouble with certain parts of it. It is antiquated, of course. It's a very old book, but it's something that, as I'm getting older, I can appreciate things for what they are more, and just kind of accept that this is just a different time, and certain things were written and such and so forth. So I guess initially we'll look at it from an overview. Basically, there's a man named Florentino Ariza. There's a woman named Fermina Daza. Florentino is, I think, 4 years older than her, or something like this. He is, or maybe it might be more actually. He might be more than that. But he falls wildly in love with this girl at a young age. We're talking about while he's like 21 or something like that. She must be like 17 or something like this. And it's from a distance. This is like old times, so there's no like going out to the club and linking. There's no co-ed existence. It's a very like structured religious time period where interactions between men and women were very limited. But he is like this like hopeless romantic, and he finds a way to sort of like venerate her in his mind, even without getting to know her really at all, and begins a correspondence of like letters that he finds a way to reach to her, and they sort of have a tumultuous exchange of letters over a period of time of maybe a year. Her father, who is a sort of shady character in his own right, is very, very interested in having his daughter elevate herself socially. So he is not supportive of this individual, Florentino, because Florentino comes from pretty humble backgrounds. His mom owns, I believe it was a hobby shop or some sort of like small store. And I forget why his father was not in the picture, but it was just him and his mother. And so for, the first beginning of his life, his father passed away, that's what it was. So he wore a lot of his father's old clothes, and he sort of had this like weird vibe about him, sort of like an old man trapped in a young person's body, and wasn't very respected. And he was an illegitimate child, so he wasn't granted the last name of his father for complicated reasons related to his mother. And so in short, he's not a suitable jump forward for Lorenzo Daza, the father of Fermina Daza, to accept that he's courting his daughter. So in an effort to sort of like put distance between them, he sends his daughter first away on a trip, to which Florentino's crazy ass tries to go and follow. And then basically, long story short, gets her connected to a prominent doctor who's respected in the town, in the area where they are. And he sort of pushes and prods along a suggested marriage, which effectively, ends the relationship for Florentino and for Fermina before it ever really started, because the father basically did everything he could to stop it. And then most of the book is the following 51 years or so, where Florentino continues to be obsessed and think of basically only her, but then also has a series of sexual relationships. What was the number? 622 affairs, allegedly, over those 51 years, while in his mind and in his heart, he convinced himself that he was somehow remaining pure for for Mina, having decided at the beginning of those 51 years that he would be waiting until the day that her husband died, and then he would pursue her. And in the end, that does end up happening. Her doctor husband, who gives her all this wealth and money, she lives a super high-level life financially, as her father had wished, however, is just as suppressed and unhappy in many ways as one might expect with a marriage born of those things. She learns to accept it with sort of like a pretty impressive level of mental reforming that she does. You might just characterize it as a sort of trauma response, as having no agency in one's life, but she was able to sort of change her expectations of life in a way that made her less miserable, and it seems as though she was able to enjoy it. But upon her husband passing, and Florentino's completely unabashed instant pressure that he put on her romantically, against her own better judgment and awareness of the social norms of the time that almost but completely disallow widows to pursue another person after their husband passes, she sort of began to fall for it and realized that this person made her happier than her husband ever did, even though her husband provided her the life that she so much cherished and the security that she so much appreciated after all those years. So it's kind of the classic case of somebody marrying for money and sort of falling in love with the comforts and the things that brought, but sacrificing their happiness, and sacrificing the quality of their life. So his complete lack of concern that 51 years had passed, and his willingness to continue at the same rate that he had 51 years prior, was sort of like a huge shock to her. That was probably her least favorite aspect of it. But what she did love was sort of the way in which it seemed that he had enriched his own life even without her, and his letters that he wrote to her following the death of her partner, of her husband, she used actually to grieve and to get through those periods of time that she was suffering as a widow. Because initially she had nothing but derision for him when he reached out 51 years later with an attempt to try to respark or rekindle their childhood romance, as it was extremely early after the death of her husband. So it was sort of upsetting, and she kind of shut that down from an initial point. But he, just being him, continued to just exist as her friend, as someone she spoke to, showing up unannounced at her house at times, and constantly just going and going and going and sort of never stopping. And so those are the sort of things where it's like, you interrogate some of that stuff, and it's like, as a as a person, you really don't want to encourage behavior like that. It's hard to root for a character with behavior like that. It's like sort of ignoring boundaries that people set constantly. Now, it's a love novel, so it's a story, so taking it at face value, it's like, oh, this man, passion of love, he waits 51 years and it's just as passionate, so that's incredible. But just me living in the society I do, living in the time that I do, it makes it a little bit less enjoyable because of that notion. So it's kind of hard to fucking buy into it 100% of the time. Then there's also the fact that some of his relationships, things that he did, were pretty absurd during the 51 years that he's supposedly perfectly preparing and waiting for his love to be ready for him. He participates in adultery in a number of ways, and gets this one woman in so much trouble that she ends up being murdered by her husband, even though he isn't found out for committing the adultery. He had scrawled on her, above her, her vagina, she had scrawled in chalk or something above her stomach, this pussy is mine or whatever, and then they forgot to wash it off. So then her husband lays with her later that night, sees that, and just on the spot murks her. And he hears about it and just doesn't do anything about it. That's just one example of the things that he did that were just unbelievably fucked, and situations that were just brushed over in the story. It's like, oh yeah, that was a tragedy, and it's 4 pages and that's it. The other big issue is sort of, there's a character that he takes charge of, as a legal guardian. The details as to why are barely described more than once, so I can't even recall off the top of my head why he finds himself in charge of her. But he, all but raises her from like the age of like, I think I remember being 13 until 21, when she was still in his care with her parents living in another country and him being sort of responsible for her. This is after he developed a little bit more success as the eventual owner of the riverboat navigation factory or company that existed in, at the time, controlling all of the riverboat transportation, both commercial and private. So he was able to afford to support someone and did so, but then towards the end of their relationship began to be sexual, at an age that is like much too early, especially with him being so much older, like being like a like middle-aged to old man. So that was hard to read, just because it's the same reason as it's just not enjoyable. It's just like it takes you out of the story for me, because it's just it's something that you just take for granted in the text, that they don't really even try to justify too much, and it's like a really bitter taste in your mouth, and it makes it harder to again connect with the character when he's letting girls or women be murdered on his behalf, when he's basically committing acts of sexual crime against young girls, even though it's portrayed in this way that's like, oh, this is consensual. It's just not. It's obviously not consensual, being that they're, underage and not able to consent, and just the way that it's painted, it just reminds me of like Lolita type text, where, Lolita does like a, mental gymnastics to try super hard to like validate it and make the character, understandable. That's why, it's like almost taught as like a look how much verbal manipulation can result in you sort of feeling for the wrong character, even though they're committing this horrible act. A lot of people that read Lolita end up liking that guy, whatever his name is, Humberg or Ham, whatever the fuck his name is. And I just remember being, in high school, being forced to read it and being like, what the fuck is this shit? Like, why do we have to read a Nabokov's weird, what is that his name of the author? I can't remember if it's Nabokov, I thought it was, but just this creep's fucking personification of a pedophile that most likely he fucking is, the way he wrote about it so goddamn lovingly and realistically. It's like, why are we reading this? So it's the same thing. It's like, it's much less of a thing in this book, and it's not focused on at all, but it's referenced from the middle half to the end of the book, and ultimately she ends up killing herself because she basically like falls in love with him, and then he sort of at the end is able to reconnect with Fermina, so he just leaves her in the fucking dust, stops even hanging out with her and shit. And so she ends up killing herself, taking a bunch of laudanum, or however you pronounce that, poison or medicine or whatever the case. She ODs herself. And, that's just like, he's like, yeah, I deal with the pangs of guilt from time to time. Like, it's just like, oh, fuck me, dude. I just like, so, all that said, I don't really love the character. I don't really love like the storyline. I don't love the way that a lot of things are portrayed, and I don't love the like anecdotal things. But all that said, there still is like a bunch of incredible writing in here that I, definitely found some enjoyment in. And I just wanted to have the knowledge of it. I don't know if people can agree with this or relate, but books, like sometimes I just want to know. It's like a dish. Like I just want to have sampled it and read it. And it's not even like I'm ever going to reread this. I wouldn't suggest this to anybody necessarily. But I wanted to read it because of its notoriety, and it did sort of document a time period and types of mentalities in a way that was interesting and was like a frame of reference and sort of like an ability to step back in the past. So that for me was worth it to read. Yes. So I'm gonna read a couple lines that I underlined, just sort of to finish it out, kind of reflect, sort of end on like a more positive note about things that I enjoy about the text, because there are some, as much as I have a lot of problems with all the other stuff I mentioned. So he, sort of like, this is what I mean about the flowering language and, you know, sort of the beautiful, like, it's so overly romanticized. Before he leaves, that time when he, you know, basically sends himself away from the town to try to get away from her, and then basically instantly returns back. But before he leaves, he needs to do all these like romantic and desperate things to signal to her like a farewell, even though she's ostensibly not even aware of his existence at that time, because she's fully married to this man well into their marriage, assuming that Florentino has moved on with his life, not really keeping tabs on him at all. She hears things here and there, we find out later, but definitely was not aware of this. So at midnight, he put on his Sunday suit and went to stand alone under Fermina Daz's balcony to play the love waltz he had composed for her, which was known only to the two of them, and which for 3 years had been the emblem of their frustrated complicity. He played, murmuring the words, his violin bathed in tears. And then, a couple sentences later, a line later, the act was an exorcism of relief the act was an exorcism of relief for Florentino Ariza, for when he put the violin back in its case and walked down the dead streets without looking back, he no longer felt that he was leaving the next morning, but that he had gone away many years before with the irrevocable determination never to return. So, it's just like, I think it's a nice depiction of both like the desperation that he experiences, the intensity that he's feeling, and also just juxtaposed against the fact that when, you sort of reference reality, there's no way that she even perceived that, or probably wasn't near the room, didn't probably hear it, but it's all about the delusion of continuing this relationship. And it's insane what someone can be motivated to hold on to, no matter what, when they are dedicated to it. So, 51 years, 31 years, 20, however long it had been, he was ready to sort of continue to lie to himself. And that's what kind of strikes me, because I think I reach levels of delusion like that often. So in a way, it's just kind of insane, because I felt like, sometimes I would find bits of myself in that, because I've held on to a relationship way too long. Not 51 years, but definitely a year longer than after we'd broken up. And like that year I spent sort of chasing this person, this idea of this person. I look back on it and cringe. And so it's like, books like this are kind of helpful to sort of remind you of what not to do, if you catch my drift. So like here, like just the level of obsession, like, quote, that was always the case. Any event, good or bad, had some relationship to her. And like, that's, when the brain is like in the sickness of a relationship or like an obsession, everything just triggers you about them. Yeah, like, every little thing, like the day before he leaves, he had awakened at 5 the next morning as a condemned man awakens at dawn on the day of his execution. It's like, oh my God, like, that's why Latinos have the perspective, or have the reputation of being fucking dramatic. But I can't agree more. And, then like, this is what, I love this, because this like kind of proves that a lot of these like Latin like misconceptions about relationships, or like these like toxic patterns have been around for so long, because so many Mexican men will be like, I love my woman with like a burning passion, I'll do anything for her, she's my world, but then like have side bitches, and then say shit like this is a quote, nothing one does in bed is immoral if it helps to perpetuate love. Like those like random sparkling ambiguities, like it's like, that doesn't fucking mean anything. It's just saying it's good to do whatever, as long as you're passionate, as long as you're feeling it, as long as you're making anyone feel good. That's hilarious, because obviously so many things are not okay, even if they make people feel good. But then, there'll be moments where he says stuff that's actually somewhat like deep and beautiful. Like on page 165, he says, allowed himself to be swayed by his conviction that human beings are not born once and for all on the day their mothers give birth to them, but that life obliges them over and over again to give birth to themselves. And I love that, because it's, there is a notion of like redemption and of improving in this book amidst all the bullshit that he commits. He really didn't have any kind of raising. Like his mom didn't really give him a lot of frame of reference on what to do per se. She kind of didn't really try to take the role of a father and raise him. And then his father wasn't there, obviously, having passed away. So he kind of just like, he just bumbled through the world, and whatever things or stuff he figured out on accident, he knew. So I thought that was actually somewhat of a deep thing for him to sort of realize. and I thought it was, well written. I can appreciate that. So let's see. More stuff that's kind of like Latino tropes that I thought were interesting to find in the text that are even like baked into his character. No work could defeat him, no matter how hard or humiliating it was. No salary, no matter how miserable, could demoralize him. And he never lost his essential fearlessness when faced with the insolence of his superiors. It just reminds me of like the indomitable spirit of Latin men, Latino men and Latino women that work, Latinx women and Latino people that work, for these bosses and these, I don't know why I said Latinx. I'm trying to be inclusive, but I'm also not trying to like get into that whole spiel about that shit, because I still don't know. I would rather we just say like, fuck Spanish and we go to like some Mayan swag, because it's like so gendered, and it's like, why do we even try to say Spanish? It's like not ours. We've only been using it for a couple 100 years, so I don't even know about editing it. I almost like, let's just make the whole revolution about speaking in Mayan, but I don't know if I'm going to teach myself Mayan, and it's like, so I don't even know. But anyway, so Latinx is the closest thing, I guess. But then I hate like the connection to like white people that police old Latinx people, like old people from the past generation that still say Latino, and then like they try to shame them, and it's like, these people don't have access to education about race politics and theory, and they don't, gender politics and theory, and so it can be like sort of like exclusionary to them while trying to be inclusionary to others, and this kind of like gotcha game of like, our parents are so fucking non-woke and all this shit, and it's like, well, were they ever given the chance to go to liberal college at USF and like learn about this shit? Like, probably not. They were fucking working in the fields or on the fucking farm. So it's kind of like a weird discourse, and I don't love to be attached to like the white Latinos that usually are the ones perpetuating it, but I stand with trans people, I stand with non-binary people, and I want to honor them in how I speak. So that's why I use Latinx, but it feels it's a complicated discourse. But in any case, Latinx people, they get treated super shittily at work. It's kind of like a trope, like, oh, you can just throw your Mexican into any situation, they'll run through a brick wall, they don't care as long as they get paid. So this text, there's no work could defeat him, no matter how hard or humiliating. He never lost his essential fearlessness when faced with the insolence of his superiors, because the superiors will be insolent, because they'll look at them as less than human and expect you to do things that are superhuman, and then sort of make fun of you the whole way. So I did like that was kind of told even in whatever fucking 1600s. So let's see a couple more. The quote that his father had written, "The only regret that I will have in dying is if it is not for love." That's something that Latinx folks really get peace from, is like knowing that they're living in love of their family, love of their community, love in what they believe in. And it gives you power and peace, because it kind of gives a purpose for your life above your own life that can never be taken from you. And I think that a lot of folks in our community can relate to that. Then he sort of starts to experience, old age. Man knows when he's growing old because he begins to look like his father. He's starting to learn a bit more about life. At the same time, Fermina is accepting a relationship, accepting a world where she's just sort of happily floating, not super happy, not super sad, just somewhere in between. Florentino gets more and more desperate, and ultimately, launches a coup on her that results in them going and falling in love, ending up on a boat of his own ownership, or of his own control, as he's the number one boss man of all the, boat routes in the Caribbean. And they basically fly the flag of cholera, so they don't have to keep picking up people that might know her and know her as a widow, so that they can be in love in secret on the boat. And then they get to the dock, and the police are asking all these questions, and he just says, you know what, fuck it, let's just go back to the other direction. Let's just keep going back and forth on the dock. And the captain's like, let me read you the last passage because it is beautiful. He says, "Do you mean what you say? From the moment I was born," said Florentino Ariza, "I have never said anything I do not mean. The captain looked at Fermina Daza and saw in her eyelashes the first glimmer of wintry frost. Then he looked at Florentino Ariza, his invincible power, his intrepid love, and he was overwhelmed by the belated suspicion that it is life, more than death, that has no limits. And how long do you think we can keep up this goddamn coming and going from dock to dock, he asked. Florentino Ariza had kept his answer ready for 53 years, 7 months, 11 days and nights. Forever, he said. And that's the end of the book. And I think that summarizes it. Fanciful, beautiful, romantic, and stubborn as all hell. I can relate with that. That sounds like some Latinx shit to me. Hope you enjoyed if you've read it. I don't suggest to read it if you haven't. Have a great day.